Hello, good evening. I am Susana Frisancho. I am the coordinator of the research group in cognition, learning, and development. I work in the psychology department at Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. And I'm gonna talk to you about how to handle informed consent in culturally diverse context. We do research and also other kind of interventions in the Amazon region of Peru, especially but not only with two indigenous groups, with the Asháninka people and the Shipibo-Conibo people. So, let's see. In this presentation, I will review the basic assumptions of informed consent, and I want to try to contrast them with the challenge, and the moral conflicts that culturally diverse contexts pose for psychological research. Of course, these ideas, the topic I'm going to be talking about, is useful for any type of research. We will focus on qualitative research. I only do qualitative research. I work with constructivistic framework, especially Piagetian, Colberian, that kind of constructivism. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you some pictures. This is called Peke Peke. This is a very common way of moving in the Amazon region through the rivers. This is the Ucayali River. Here I am. This is an Asháninka leader who went with us in this expedition. Here I am again with some of my students, just trying to walk, through this kind of mud or something, walking in these trees. This is some children. It's just for you to have a view, like a taste of how are the communities when we go to do this kind of research. This is a school. This is a former student of mine, and these girls are from the Asháninka people. Here I am with my colleague Enrique Delgado doing some interviews with two Asháninka women, and Benigno Vicente is helping us with the language, because usually, especially women, but not only, they used to be monolingual. They don't speak Spanish, or not, they don't master Spanish, or they feel more comfortable doing the interview in their language. Okay. So let's begin with these basic ideas. The matter of informed consent is a basic component of psychological research. So when we are studying psychology, we have a lot of, I will say, pressure to understand what is informed consent. Every psychologist should be well acquainted with its basic formats and procedures, and aware of its foundational principles of respect for the dignity, autonomy, and freedom of persons. However, there are some researchers, and of course, indigenous peoples themselves, have long critiqued the harmful effects of hegemonic or Eurocentric research processes upon indigenous culture and communities. So, of course, the way, like informed consent is usually done, sometimes don't match expectations and characteristics of indigenous peoples. That's a fact, I will say. There are instances in psychological practice when compliance with the established conventions of informed consent proves difficult. And thus, it becomes necessary to develop alternate methods to guarantee that the basic underlying ethical principles are observed. So the idea is not just to follow step 1, step 2, step 3, but to really master what are the ethical principles that we have to respect. And with that in mind, we can make some changes. I will talk about what are the necessary changes that we have learned we have to make when working with this native community. Okay, let's go. our experience, I'm going to talk about one specific experience with the Asháninka people, but this applies for any other native Amazonian, original people community. Our experience working with the Asháninka community on the Tomajao River Basin in the Ucayali region of Peru showed us that many of the conventional protocols are insufficient or even inadequate as means towards a legitimate informed consent from these participants. Why? Let's continue. Because their different cultural background, lack of acquaintance with research procedures, and different way of understanding social relationships, when working with indigenous communities, the cultural and social context of informed consent need to be considered. And of course, there are some research that shows that people from cultural diverse background have different expectations for the research process and may perceive it in a different way than people from Western nations. There is one reference for this here. Okay, so the key idea is that we must understand, and of course honor, that what is important is to guarantee the observance of the principles underlying informed consent. And of course, to guarantee that the rights of the participants concerning rational decision-making, empowerment are respected. So as long as these aims are kept in mind, the specific means, for instance, whereas a written form or a meeting with the whole community, etc., may vary. And indeed, I will say they need to vary. Our experience have shown us that the communities ask for us a different way to do the informed consent. And we have to adapt our means to just honor the principles, the ethical principles that we want to reach. What are the traditional informed consent assumptions? I will say that there are these ones. First, when we are carrying out an informed consent procedure, we think different things. For instance, we assume familiarity with legal documents, terms, and concepts. Okay? We assume the adequacy of individual consent. We also assume familiarity with research studies. We assume the recognition of equal status and reciprocal relationship between subjects, between people in the community, for instance, and the researchers. And we also assume the need for confidentiality and anonymity. All these assumptions are challenged when we work with indigenous peoples. For instance, they are not familiar with legal documents. Moreover, they are suspicious of them because we can understand that historically they have made sign a lot of papers, and that finally the result of that paperwork and signature has been that they have lost their territories. So they are afraid and very, very suspicious of the papers. Most of them can be illiterate, so they don't write, they don't read. So it's kind of a different world. So we cannot assume this familiarity. We cannot assume either that individual consent is sufficient. We have learned that we need to ask for permission from the chiefs of the community before individual participants are contacted. So I'm going to show you later, we do both, like a collective permission and then an individual consent for each participant. But the individual consent is the last point. The collective consent and the permission from the chiefs is the first step we have to take. Of course, they are unfamiliar with research logic and methods. They have no knowledge about this. This is new for them. We don't have an equal status. They have been victims of historical oppression and inequality, and that have a very important impact, and we have to really consider this issue carefully. And this is a very interesting thing, no? Psychologists are always taught that we have to keep confidentiality, anonymity, that we don't have to, you know, like make explicit the names of the participants or any data that can make people to recognize who the participant is. But in the case of indigenous communities, it's the other way around. When we ask them if how they want, you know, like the confidentiality to be handled, they always want to appear in the research article, in the book, or wherever, with their names. Their names in Spanish, their names in Asháninka. No? They want to be recognized. They feel that to show up in that way, you know, is important, that people need to know who they are and what their knowledge is, and so on and so forth. So this point is really very important. So what else? So how to deal with these challenges? Of course, informed consent should be adapted to the particular cultural characteristics of each indigenous community. And we have to balance ends versus means. This is very important because too frequently people understand informed consent as a mechanical process. I have to give a piece of paper, I have to read the piece of paper to people, people have to say, yes, I agree, then they have to sign. And this is very mechanical, no? With this group of indigenous communities, we have to forget about mechanical things. We have to really balance ends versus means. And we have to not simply adapt, no, quoting the process to superficial aspects, for instance, no, translating the same piece of paper, no, from Spanish to the Asháninka, just to mention one example, no, but really adapting more profoundly. No? We have to, I better give some examples in a little while, let's say. Okay. So what are the main purposes of informed consent? Following these authors here, we think that there are these four main purposes we have to keep always in mind. The first one is to promote autonomy and empowerment. For instance, by acknowledging the participants' right to accept or decline to be part of the research. The second main purpose is to promote rational decision-making. For instance, by providing the necessary information for the participant to be able to choose when he or she considers the best option, what he or she considers the best option. Third, to protect and to minimize harm to the participant by informing about the possible risk and implications of being involved in the research, as well as giving the participants the opportunity to communicate if they are under risk or adverse effects. And finally, to promote collaboration by gaining the trust of the participants through disclosure and dispelling doubts, okay? So we have to keep in mind these four main purposes when we set the process of informed consent with indigenous peoples in indigenous communities. This is very important. For instance, you know, sometimes people didn't want to be interviewed at 10 in the morning when we thought that was the best time for us. They didn't want. They wanted to work in their piece of land or to be cooking or whatever. And then they said, okay, come back at 3 or at 4. And yeah, that's fine. They have the right to give their schedule, their, their time, and we have to adapt, to their possibilities and not the other way around. Okay. So, how we did the process of informed consent in the Asháninka native community called Tomajao. This is our pathway, let's say. The informed consent, I will say, took 2 years. So it's not the 5 minutes when we have the piece of paper and we read and the people sign, no. It took more or less 2 years because it began with the first contact with the community through teachers of leaders. So we have like a team, I will say, of Asháninka people in this case that work with us, and they make the first contact because they have to travel to that river or another river in advance. They have to ask for permission from the chief. They will say, okay, there's this group of researchers. I know them, I trust them. No, this is the second step, no? The explanation to the community chief to the purposes of our visit. So in order that the chief and the community accepts to work with us, we have to make this initial contact through leaders, teachers, people they trust from the same indigenous peoples. Okay, then we, when this is done, so a person travels there, the person comes back, then we have our first community meeting. This community meeting is a meeting between us, of course, several months after the first contact, between us and the community, the whole community, the children, the parents, the mothers, the fathers, the chief, the school teachers, the Cherepiari, that is the wise man, the chamanes, everybody was there. So, in that meeting, our indigenous partners, the ones that went, they took the first step traveling beforehand, they introduced us to the community. There was a speech, in this case was by the school teacher. Then we introduced ourselves, explain what our purpose were, where we come from, why we want to work with them, what we offer to them, so on and so forth. Then, oops, let me show some pictures. Okay, here we are. Then the chief asked the community, it's okay, do you accept that this group of researchers come here? Are you willing to respond to their questions? Do you accept them? And the whole community say yes. Then we present some gifts to the community. This is very important point, because usually to us psychologists, when we study these things, they say to us that we don't have to give any present, any gift. But in this case, they have the expectation. It's a cultural practice to go to the community taking something for the community as a whole. So in the first contact, the person who went asked them what they need. And they said, okay, we need a machete, for instance. We don't have machetes, or we need some kind of school supplies for the school because we don't have pencils or whatever. Okay, so we took this kind of stuff for them. We also have some kind of individual presence, but utilitarian, for people who are our interviewees. Usually they want hats for the sun, or that kind of cloth, I don't know the name in English, mosquitero, so to prevent the mosquitoes to go into the houses, or pots to cook, that kind of stuff, okay? After this, they had prepared an artistic show for us. It was very nice, traditional songs, the kids sang a Asháninka song for us. Then we shared a dinner. That was very impressive because went hunting for us. And they hunted a tapir. They call it sachavaca. In English, I think it's tapir. So they cooked the tapir and we ate with them. And then after all this, that was one day, we did the individual informed consent before each interview. So, but each of them already had agreed, in the communal meeting. And then we present our gifts to each of the participants. So there is some pictures of the process of the community meeting. That there are the kids. We have permission to show these pictures from the community. Some of the kids who sang for us. This is our Ali, the one who traveled beforehand. So he was speaking here. Here I am with my colleague Enrique giving some of the presents. This is the chief of the community, the one with Ushma. Ushma is the dress, no, they use. It's made from cotton. Okay. So, lessons learned. First, do not create false expectations, of course. Reciprocity and trustworthiness are important values for indigenous people. So it's crucial to be clear about what we are offering them and not to offer more than we can honor. This is really, really important. Presents. Usually traditional informed consent protocol discourage giving present to research participants, as I already said. However, there are a sign of gratitude and reciprocity for their time and willingness to participate. They value and expect them. Presents should be culturally sensitive and useful for the community. And the third idea, that it is really crucial, very important to have allies. They allow us to build confidence, teach us about cultural traditions and values, and prepare the ground for our arrival. So we cannot do this research without them. They help us with the language. They help us going beforehand to make the contact with the community. They help us teaching us a lot of things that we have no idea about, because we are not that familiar sometimes with the traditional cultural practices. We have learned a lot during the years, but still we are foreigners. So it's very important to have these alliances. And I think this is it. Thank you very much. Gracias. I hope this has been interesting for you. I will be very aware if you have questions, and or we have to talk a little bit more about our research. Bye.